Scott Loveridge with the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's session on water policy. Our speaker today is Adam Reimer, who's a postdoctoral research associate with the W.K. Kellogg Biological Station at Michigan University. And Adam just recently completed a stint with the NARDEP Center, and this work is coming out of some of the work he started while with us at the center. And I think with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Adam, to tell us what you're about today.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Scott, and thank you to all those who joined us today. Water is a very important topic, as I'm sure most of you would agree. That's why you're here, I assume. It's also a very expansive topic, so I don't want to delay kind of getting into things. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, again, water is an incredibly expansive topic. And any of the individual issues that I discussed today could probably deserve their own hour-long webinar. So in many ways, this is going to be a very broad overview of water policy from the federal perspective. I'll talk a little bit about what states are doing, but again, primarily from the national level. I'm also going to focus on inland water systems as opposed to coastal regions or oceans, which again is kind of its own topic. So today, I'd start out with a very brief history of U.S. water policy, and kind of tell you about how the system has developed the way it has. Do a very brief overview of federal water laws and agencies, mainly just the very key players, though there are certainly myriad agencies and laws that have an impact on water resources. So most of the talk today is going to be about ongoing and emerging challenges with water, and then recent policy trends and innovations. So first, a couple of things that are, I think, important to know off the bat. Typically, when we talk about water policy, we talk about two threads: water use and consumption, or water supply to humans, and then water quality. The best way to describe U.S. or federal water policy is a high level of fragmentation. As I said, there are a number of agencies involved in managing water resources in various ways. We tend to have compartmentalized various aspects of water into some sort of neat boxes, which has created a very complex system. There's a dynamic of state versus federal, and one of the things I'll talk about here in a minute in terms of history is that the federal government has been increasing its scope over water throughout the history of the United States. To kind of give away the ending, as it were, one of the things we're going to talk about in terms of emerging trends, and these are things to kind of pay attention to throughout the talk, say we see increasing agency coordination, landscape scale management, public involvement, ecosystem restoration, and adaptive management. And we'll talk about each of those in more depth later on. So again, I will keep the history of water policy quite brief to kind of break down the history of the United States into some big chunks. And generally, I think one of the important things to understand is that the United States was settled largely from the East Coast, especially in terms of national level policy. And the East Coast happens to be, as the map here shows, one of the most water abundant regions in the country. So early on, there was not a perception that water was a concern for the federal government, and the government early on adopted European or especially English systems of water policy, and largely left water issues under local control. In the latter half of the 19th century, the U.S. government was very focused on expansion to the west, into regions that are not as water rich. There was a heavy focus at the federal level on transportation, so there was a canal building boom in the 1800s. Also a little bit of flood control, sort of managing water systems for economic development. That continued on into the early part of the 20th century with this big boom in storage reservoirs, things like the Hoover Dam shown here, building up the water capacity, water supply, particularly in the western United States, but certainly all over the country, saw this sort of boom in water infrastructure. It started to change in the 1950s and 60s with the growth of the environmental movement, and as I'll talk about here in a moment, the the social environmental movement really changed the awareness of water quality issues, and the federal government made a big expansion in terms of federal power and federal scope over water to start addressing water quality issues. In the 1980s through the end of the 20th century saw this process of devolution. So the federal government had been kind of slowly accumulating power over water resources throughout the history of the United States. And by the 1980s, there was this trend of turning some of the responsibility back to states. Not necessarily in a completely devolved way, but more in a system where states were still required, states or localities were required to meet federal standards through these sort of unfunded mandates, but were sort of responsible for doing it on their own. One of the side effects of that is that states and municipalities really built up a lot of capacity in terms of their ability to manage water resources. So just to talk again very briefly about water laws and agencies, by one count I saw there are over 20 major federal laws that impact water and something over 40 agencies that have a view, and certainly I won't talk about all of those, just hitting on the sort of big players, if you will. Now, let's start out with the Clean Water Act. Again, as I said, the environmental movement in the 60s saw this dramatic change in public attention on water quality. So the Clean Water Act was kind of a result of that movement. So it passed in 1972. It really dramatically expanded the federal government's power over water resources to not only manage the sort of navigability of waterways, but also the quality of the water within the waterway, if you will. There are two major mechanisms of the Clean Water Act. The first is to designate uses of waters. The term often used for the Clean Water Act is that it regulates the waters of the United States, and that is kind of a broadly an ill-defined term that is constantly undergoing flux, particularly in the courts, as the court system decides sort of what that means and where the federal government has power and where that is limited. The Clean Water Act, though, requires EPA and states to work together to designate uses for waterways, with the stated goal of making all of the waters of the United States fishable and swimmable, and then setting water quality standards for those waterways. And then the second component is regulating point sources of pollution through the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or the NPDES permitting system. And what that does is it simply regulates all point sources, or sort of a definable endpoint of an actor who, whether it's a factory or a municipality or municipal water system that discharges effluent into a waterway, and those are all required to be permitted. One of the other federal laws that I think deserves a quick mention is the Safe Drinking Water Act, which this is also a result of the environmental movement to set public drinking water standards across the country. One of the other components of it is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which I will talk about more in a moment, but that's a funding mechanism whereby the federal government helps support municipal public drinking water sources. There are a lot of federal laws, kind of permanent laws, that have an impact on water that I didn't mention here, including the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the Endangered Species Act. Those do have broad impacts as well. There's also legislation that has a significant impact that doesn't get a lot of attention. The sort of ongoing appropriation type and authorizing legislation. So in terms of water, one of the most important is the Water Resources Development Act. So this is a periodic piece of legislation that Congress passes to fund water agencies, to fund water projects across the country. The last Water Resources Development Act was passed in 2007, and this year Congress has been debating a new bill. So that is in conference now and should be passed by the end of the year. In terms of water agencies, a couple that I'll mention in terms of water supply or managing kind of physical water systems would be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Despite its name, it is a significant civilian agency. It has over 37,000 civilian employees. It's traditionally been focused on navigation and flood control, but over the last 20 or 30 years, they've dramatically expanded their scope to do other things as well. while they're well known for maintaining things like levees and harbors and things like that, they also manage 25% of the U.S. hydroelectric power system, especially in the western United States. The other important water supply agency is the Bureau of Reclamation, which is part of the Department of Interior. This agency is specifically designed to manage water resources in the western states. It provides water storage for a number of purposes, including irrigated agriculture, drinking water systems, and recreation. The EPA, which I would imagine most of you are familiar with, is a primary federal agency in charge of water quality. They do a lot of things, but one of the most important roles is administering the Clean Water Act provisions, including the national permitting system, maintaining the list of impaired waters. When I use the term impaired, that refers to any water body that fails to meet any of the water quality standards set for it. One of the other things the EPA does that's quite important is they maintain technical and financial resources for pollution reduction. These would include two funding mechanisms: the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. These fund a number of projects at the state and local level, from public-owned water systems to wastewater management systems. They're even increasingly funding non-point source pollution control mechanisms, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Okay, so we've gotten through sort of the basic introduction to the system as it is. I want to focus in now on a number of challenges in terms of water. I'm going to break down this part of the talk into water supply and water quality, with again the large caveat that these are increasingly connected, or seen as connected. I suppose they've always been connected. It's just that at the policy level we're now really understanding that these two are intimately related. Nonetheless, I'm going to kind of break it down in this fashion just for kind of ease of understanding. Just to give you a sense of how water is used in the United States, this is the most recently available federal data, although it's almost 10 years old now, in terms of water usage. And when I say water usage, what I mean is water that comes from some sort of definable source or pipe. So this would not include the more passive uses of water like rain-fed agriculture. As we see here, power generation and agriculture really dominate water use across the country. Agriculture here would refer to irrigated agriculture. Most of this is in the western states. The 11% here is the non-domestic public supply. That's the municipal supply. So what we think of in terms of water that gets piped to homes and businesses, maintained by municipalities typically. I'm going to talk briefly about surface water rights. Again, this is an area that's largely still been left to the states in terms of allocating who gets access to water. There are 3 state doctrines that have developed over time. Generally, riparian rights are found in the eastern U.S., where water rights are part of a property ownership. So if you own a piece of property along a waterway, you have the right to use water in a reasonable fashion from that water body. In the western United States, we had a system, or we have more water scarcity. As part of the expansion movement, we developed this system of prior appropriation, so typically referred to as first in time, first in right, where essentially the early settlers were guaranteed that they could maintain water rights in order to promote people moving out and establishing farms and businesses in the West. This led to a lot of tension over time. These are contentious issues in terms of managing water and who has access to water. As we see from the picture here, it can be quite contentious. And then there are also hybrid systems that kind of blend the two, where riparian landowners might have a riparian right, and then other owners have kind of a prior appropriated system. These are very broad generalizations, it should be known, and there's a lot of variation within these systems and from state to state. So depending on what state you're in, the water allocation could be quite different. In terms of groundwater, typically groundwater policies have been disconnected from surface water, primarily because they were developed later. A lot of the national or the state level surface water allocation policies were set in the 1800s. Groundwater resources were largely developed in the early 1900s. So there was a sort of disconnect. Some states are now in the process of trying to recombine their ground and surface water policies into a more unified system. Typically, groundwater is treated on a first come first serve basis. So you have rights. A landowner has a right to develop groundwater resources from their land. And so the result of that is that most groundwater systems are privately developed. Groundwater depletion is a serious concern. The map here is from a USGS study that shows the loss in water volume from aquifers over the 19th century, or the 20th century, excuse me. Just a handful. They looked at a handful of the large aquifers across the country, and as you can see, the areas in red and orange and yellow are areas that have been depleted over time, some of them significantly. And this is an ongoing concern because, as you can see, many of the areas with significant depletion also happen to be water scarce areas. So there's a lot of attention drawn now to the issue of groundwater depletion and the sustainability of groundwater resources. So in terms of water supply, one of the big issues nationally, again, this is mostly being dealt with by states, but it is a national issue in many ways, that prior appropriation systems don't necessarily have an incentive for efficiency. So these systems typically develop where you have a right to water as long as you're putting it to some sort of, quote, beneficial use, however that's defined. And if you don't use that water that you're allocated, you can lose it over time, and that can be given to somebody else, which means there's an incentive essentially to use as much water as you can, whether it's efficient or not. So many states are now interested in adjusting these policies and trying to sort of rein in use a little bit. There's increased pressure on existing water supplies. As I noted, the era of big construction of public water systems, particularly in the western states, was mostly in the early part of the 20th century. By the 1970s and 80s, the era of building new public water systems was sort of over. And that's not to say that the areas haven't been continuing to develop water systems, but by and large, the water capacity of the United States has stayed more or less the same over time, yet population has grown. There's also been increasing per capita use. Again, it's not the same in all parts of the country. There's a lot of variation, but all of this has resulted in increasing concern with the sustainability of water supplies over time. It's also led to some tensions over regional disparities in water. So areas, say out west, that are more water poor tend to be looking at water-rich regions as a solution for their public supplies, and states like Michigan that are water-rich are not as anxious to give up their water resources. Another significant issue is aging infrastructure, and these are again related. So the infrastructure, public supply infrastructure, in many ways is now 40 to 50 years old or older, and that over time those systems degrade. You get things like leaking pipes that lead to inefficiencies and water losses. And these systems are primarily managed by state and local systems as well as private. A lot of municipalities have privatized their water supply system. With this general underlying federal support. So as I mentioned, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund helps support or provide loans to municipal supplies for projects. But this is sort of an ongoing issue, and one that many municipalities have had to delay kind of managing their infrastructure as state and local budgets have taken cuts and seen reduced tax revenues and whatnot since 2008. This is a problem that many places have had to kind of push off. One of the areas in which states and municipalities have been very active is trying to promote efficiency and conservation. So far, the federal government hasn't shown a lot of attention to this, other than providing technical support to localities. So this is one of the areas where states have been kind of the laboratories of experimentation, if you will, on promoting efficiency. And they've turned to a number of different techniques, including water loss management. So this would be things like improving transmission systems, fixing leaky pipes, things that prevent losses of water during transportation. Water reuse and recycling programs, market mechanisms, so changing the pricing structure, offering customers incentives for efficiency, things like that. Cooperative water management, so managing water at a large scale, a landscape scale or a system scale. And conjunctive land use and water management. The image I have here shows there's New York City's water supply system, and New York City obviously is the country's largest city, provides drinking water to millions of people. And that water comes from a few areas in upstate New York that are or Connecticut that are important. And New York has turned to this sort of conjunctive land use and water planning, so managing the area that the water comes from as much as the water itself. Underlying all of these challenges with water supply is the specter of climate change. So all of these would be issues even without climate variability and climate change. But this sort of increases those concerns across the board. The image I show here just shows one projection of what could happen by 2050 in terms of water scarcity, water resource sustainability. Note here that the image on the right, that a lot of those areas in red are also areas that have already depleted groundwater, areas that tend to be water poor to begin with, and will just become more so. And unfortunately, many of these areas, or one of the big challenges, that these areas happen to also be some of the fastest growing in terms of population. Okay, so I'll turn now to water quality. Again, with the idea that water quality and water supply are increasingly seen as connected. So as I mentioned earlier, the environmental movement of the 60s really changed the public perception of water. Prior to that, water was largely, particularly at a policy level, was kind of seen as a means of conveyance, a method to transport waste away. By the 1960s, people were increasingly concerned with the quality of the water in a particular place. The initial concern was with point source pollution. If you think back to the image I showed, which I didn't point out, but there was a picture of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally on fire, or at least the pollutants on the surface of the water on fire. Raised a lot of concern with things like industrial pollutants, heavy metals, sewage from urban areas, petrochemicals, PCBs. The early environmental legislation, Clean Water Act, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, was really focused primarily at reducing these forms of pollution. 40 years on, after passage of the Clean Water Act, we still see significant impairment. Now, the challenges have changed, the sources of impairment have changed. That doesn't mean that these point sources are no longer a concern. In many ways, we are still concerned with these, particularly some of the legacy effects. So, PCBs or heavy metals can persist in the environment for a long time. But generally, the concern has shifted now to what are known as non-point source pollution. So if you think of a point source as coming from a discrete pipe, non-point source is just all of the runoff from everything else. Defined or characterized by the fact that they come from a variety of sources. They're difficult to identify exactly where they're coming from. As the image here shows, it could be coming from urban areas, residential areas, farms or livestock facilities. Some of these pollutants, or things that we think of as pollutants, are natural flows as well, and so there's a natural component that human activity is layering on top of. When we talk about non-point source pollutants, we're typically talking about things like nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, sediment, road chemicals. So, if we think about petrochemicals, we've largely tried to address the petrochemicals coming from point sources, but there's still a large quantity of oil and gasoline and things like that spill on the ground and eventually make their way into waterways. And these non-point sources are now the major source of water impairment across the country. When we talk about nutrients, one of the major concerns are these kind of cumulative effects. So one of the common examples is the dead zone or the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So hypoxia simply refers to a lack of dissolved oxygen, which then reduces the ability of aquatic life to live in that area for a time. Hypoxia in the Gulf is largely attributed to runoff of nutrients from the Mississippi River Basin, which, as you can see here from the map, is a significant portion of the continental United States. So the cumulative effect of all the runoff from farm fields and residential lawns and things like that ultimately make their way down to the Gulf of Mexico and cause this seasonal problem. There's also another category known as emergent pollutants of concern. These typically refer to just a myriad of household chemicals with uncertain impacts. They're referred to as emerging pollutants, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're new in the environment, simply that we're now becoming more aware of their presence and are starting to investigate their impacts. So these would be things like pharmaceuticals, household cleaners, personal care products, things like soaps and antibiotic washes, things like that. These are very widespread in the environment as we're now becoming aware. A 2002 study by the USGS looked at just a fairly small number of water bodies, something like 125 waterways throughout the United States, and found that a number of these chemicals are found in a large number of these water bodies. So these are fairly widespread in the environment. One of the issues with these is that treatment systems aren't designed to address these. So public, when wastewater in a municipal area goes to a public treatment plant where it's treated for nutrients and for bacteria and solids, so that the water there is relatively clean, but in many ways it still has these chemicals in it, and we haven't been aware. Early evidence is starting to show that some of these can have significant negative impacts on aquatic ecosystems. So because of the increased concern over non-point source pollutants, the 1990s especially saw this transition to a more holistic water quality management system. So in 1992, with Clean Water Act amendments, they created the total maximum daily load system. And what this does is it's a whole water body management system. So you determine a use for a water body, and then you calculate acceptable pollutant levels. So at what level of pollution would it still be able to meet the water quality standards? And then this is the key part of the TMDL process, is that you then apportion out pollution levels to various actors. This is a shift from previous policy with the permitting system, because this addresses both point sources and non-point sources. The important thing to note here, though, is that mandatory limits are only for point sources. This does not, so you can apportion out pollutant levels to non-point sources, but there's nothing binding that forces, farmers or landowners or municipal residents to do anything to meet those standards. The TMDL process is watershed-based, so for those of you who might not be familiar, a watershed simply refers to the area of land that drains into a particular water body. The important part about this kind of management system is that it cuts across political boundaries, which will have some ramifications I show in a minute. And then public involvement is a key part of the TMDL process as well, which certainly makes sense given that non-point source pollutants are generally coming from society at large, or the public, so it's important to get the public on board in order to try to manage those. So with the time I have left, I want to talk a little bit more about the recent trends and innovations, and you'll see that I've mentioned a number of these already throughout the presentation. We've seen, particularly since the era of devolution in the 1980s and 90s, this increasing sense that the agencies have to work together, have to coordinate actions and then collaborate as well, which is kind of a deeper level of coordination where you're actually coming together to plan and execute plans on a large scale. There are a wide range of types of coordination and collaboration, which we see federal, state, local, private, sometimes all together. One of the other important things to note about this trend is that it is increasingly integrating water supply management and water quality management. So you think about agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation or Army Corps of Engineers that tended to focus on their one or two areas of responsibility, whether it was public water supply or flood control, and they weren't concerned with, say, water quality or meeting water quality standards. And that system of kind of partitioning or fragmenting out the aspects of water management is kind of in the past now, and agencies are increasingly coming together, combining expertises to address water at a larger scale. The example I'll give here is the California Federal Bay Delta Program, known as CalFed. This involves 23 different agencies at the federal, state, local level that have come together over the last decade or so. The ultimate goal here is to create a combined management plan, comprehensive management plan for the entire Central Valley of California that flows into the Pacific Ocean here near San Francisco, or in the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is a level of coordination that these agencies didn't used to do, but are now seen as an important aspect of or way to manage, both by essentially combining budgets and, as I said, expertises to bring different things to bear, but also the recognition that water systems are complex and large and need to be managed at a large scale in order to really see effective management, which leads me to the next trend, which is watershed management or landscape scale management. So again, this is management by a basin or a land area as opposed to simply a political jurisdiction. So again, these cross-cut political boundaries, and you have various agencies at the state, federal, local level that are responsible for managing a particular water resource, but they're all kind of within a larger water system, and so these two aspects go hand in hand. Watershed management is increasingly being used to target non-point source pollutants as well through the TMDL process. And the quick example here is the Chesapeake Bay area. So Chesapeake Bay on the East Coast includes land from 6 different states in the District of Columbia, and those states and all the not all of the localities, but a number of localities within those states, the federal government have come together to create a TMDL for the entire basin that's now been completed and hopefully will be implemented over time. One of the things we also see is that citizen involvement in watershed management is key to long-term success. A recent study showed, looking at TMDLs, shows that the big step with TMDLs is from the planning stage, which is difficult but still relatively easy compared to implementing that plan and actually trying to implement the changes from that planning process. And the presence of civic watershed groups is highly correlated with actual implementation on the ground. It's not exactly clear what the causal relationship that is there, but I think it's fairly intuitive to think that the areas that have a broad base of public support are going to be more successful at actually implementing changes on the ground. Let's talk a little bit more about public involvement. It's largely driven by increasing public awareness of water issues. Again, the environmental movement really changed the way society in general views water resources and their and community and individual responsibilities to water issues. It kind of relates to a much older trend in water, which is multiple use management, which I haven't talked about a lot, but the idea of managing water resources for multiple uses rather than just managing, the Mississippi River for navigation and reservoir for public drinking water. We tend to manage water resources for a variety of needs now, which sees a lot of different attention from various groups of people. I'll talk a little bit about the EPA 319 program, which doesn't have a very glamorous or informative name, but this is the major funding and technical resource arm that the EPA has under the Clean Water Act to fund public involvement, typically in terms of watershed groups, civic watershed groups at the local level. So it's a grant-based program that provides these sorts of local watershed councils or watershed groups with technical and financial resources to be able to, whether it's going through a TMDL process or trying to manage particularly non-point source pollution in a more holistic public way. One of the other trends we see is ecosystem restoration. So you could look at the history of water resources in the United States as a series of degradations and modifications to water systems, to natural ecosystems, which has led to a loss of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services refers to all of the benefits that a natural system provides to humans. Typically we talk about, with water, we're talking about things like flood control and water storage, water filtering, so helping with improving water quality, wildlife and fisheries habitat, and storm protection. Storm protection in general especially has gotten a lot of attention since 2006 with Hurricane Katrina, and focusing more public attention on loss of coastal wetlands and coastal water systems that can help buffer against significant storms. So ecosystem restoration is something that agencies are increasingly interested in and involved in, and you even have more traditional construction agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers involved heavily in ecosystem restoration. A great example of this, really at a massive scale, is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which again is a very collaborative effort of dozens of agencies, the state, local, and federal level, that have come together to try to restore the ecosystems in the southern part of Florida, to provide these sorts of ecosystem services that I talked about. And the Army Corps of Engineers is a key part of that. Adaptive management is the last topic I want to address. One of the things that's important to take away about water systems is that they're connected, they're complex, and they're dynamic, meaning they change significantly over time, which can lead to significant unintended consequences. In some ways, the history of water management is unintended consequences, as we have modified natural ecosystems and pushed things like flood control and water storage that has degraded ecosystems to the point where they don't necessarily provide all of the water quality or environmental benefits that we would like to see. Adaptive management is a system for sort of recognizing the complexity and size of these issues. Its key feature is really the idea of experimentation and information guiding management. So with complex systems that are changing over time, that we recognize now we don't fully understand, and we can't anticipate all unintended consequences, that leads to the incentive to have flexible management, to have flexible policy systems that can incorporate information over time and change management or policy systems in order to address emerging issues, or as we understand better what's going on in that system. Adaptive management is particularly seen as important for addressing climate change, which again is a significant concern that kind of affects everything I've talked about today. An adaptive system, management systems or policy systems, can allow for potentially better responses as we get a better sense of the changes that are coming over the coming decades in terms of water. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their attention today and for being here, and I'd love to take some questions from people and maybe have a bit of a discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Adam. And I've pulled up the evaluation form as well, so if folks could fill that out, that would be good as we talk. Looks like Les has a question about the Clean Water Act not regulating non-point sources, but individual states can and do, and some do. State feedlot rules, and in Minnesota are examples. So I guess he's just kind of pointing out that there are some options at the state level that folks could consider as well.
Yes, if I could comment on that, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. And again, one of the limitations of trying to squeeze in a 35-minute talk on water is that that you're not going to be able to cover everything. So it's important to note that at the federal level, there isn't direct regulation of non-point sources. Although there is some large animal feeding operations are required to have discharge permits as well. But in general, states have a little more authority, or quite a bit more authority to regulate or try to affect non-point source pollution, and some states have been very active in that. So that's one of the other aspects of devolution, is that the EPA and the federal government put increasing pressure on states, and then those states are really responsible for trying to find the best policy mechanisms or management systems to be able to meet those standards, whether it's point source or non-point source pollution.
So, what if the worst case scenarios occur that with climate change? What do you see as, is it going to be possible for a devolved environment to function, given that these water bodies and aquifers cross state lines? Is that really a realistic scenario if the worst comes to pass in terms of the drying out of the Southwest?
Yeah, that's an excellent question or scenario, and one that I don't think are necessarily easy answers to. I suspect that one of the things that really marks water resources in the United States is that they are very unequally distributed across the country, and that's always affected the way states, regions, and the federal government have approached water resources. And climate change is just going to exacerbate those differences. And at some point, I would imagine the federal government will need to step in and help to manage some of those regional disparities, whether it's managing transfers across regions or setting some sort of standards. The federal government's already shown some action on that in terms of managing international relationships, so managing water systems with our neighbors Mexico and Canada, and making some international arrangements in terms of managing, say, the Great Lakes, with the intention of keeping as much of the Great Lakes water resources in the Great Lakes region and not exporting that out to other areas. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, Scott, but I suspect there will be increasing federal attention to this as states and regions start to maybe have slightly more contentious interactions over water.
What about, so you talked about efficiency, what about, we've got oceans and there's desalination kinds of things. Is there anything on the horizon that would help increase the supply in those areas through that kind of technology?
I know that desalination has been looked at by a number of places in terms of increasing supply. One of the things about desalination, in my understanding, is that it's very energy intensive, and as energy prices have generally risen, that decreases the kind of cost effectiveness of that as an option. One of the things I didn't really talk about was the idea of water pricing. So the federal government, again, has built and maintains all of these water systems, particularly in the West, and so water prices generally are perceived as being subsidized by the federal government. So one of the mechanisms that states have tried to experiment with is increasing the price of water, and if municipalities need to go to things like desalination that are more expensive, that will necessarily increase the price of water for consumers, which may have an effect of decreasing consumption over time. But I'm not sure that on a kind of federal level, at a large scale, desalination is necessarily a viable option.
No, I think it'd be more of a private sector solution in places where well, I guess the public sector might be more on the research side of trying to come up with technologies that are perhaps less expensive. But yeah. And I'm not sure if Charlie Abdallah is typing a question or if he's multitasking. I see that he's typing, but I don't know if it's about this or not. I haven't seen a chat question come in from him. Has anybody else got a question for Adam today? Well, if not, I want to thank you, Adam, for a very well organized and informative discussion that I'm sure others can use in a variety of settings. Oh, there's something from Charles. Okay. How would you evaluate the overall success of market-based approaches, e.g. trading, in improving water quality?
That is an excellent question. I'm glad somebody asked it, because an earlier draft of this presentation had a slide where I was going to talk about market-based approaches, specifically water quality trading, and in terms of time, I felt it was one of the things that got cut. So I'm glad that I get a chance to talk about it here. So water quality trading schemes have been something that have garnered a lot of attention since the 1990s. Their implementation has been more limited across the country. I would say in general their success again is limited, mainly because they're only suitable for really addressing certain kinds of issues. Mainly, we tend to think about water quality trading between point sources that are regulated and non-point sources that are at the federal level unregulated. So a water quality trading scheme would allow point sources to offset or trade their reduction requirements with non-point sources who might be able to reduce pollution at a lower cost or more efficiently. So you can then over time essentially set up a quasi-regulatory system where non-point sources are kind of brought under that regulatory scheme. So if you were to say ratchet down requirements for point sources to reduce things like nutrients, they could then trade those reductions with non-point sources, and you could see an overall decrease in pollution levels. So that said, they're only really suitable in instances where there are point sources that you can then actively trade with. So nutrients are a good example, and to my knowledge, the area that's probably seen the most activity in terms of water quality trading, where you have, say, a municipal treatment facility that is allowed to emit some certain level of nutrients into a waterway, but those reductions might be fairly expensive, and you could allow them to trade with, say, farmers who could implement management practices on their land to decrease nutrients, and again, thereby getting some sort of reduction overall. It doesn't necessarily work where you have, say, chemicals from roadways or these emerging pollutants that I mentioned, where you have an even larger number of diffuse sources and you really don't know exactly where it's coming from, and there's not a very good mechanism for setting up that trading scheme where you can identify non-point sources who could be paid by a point source to reduce their pollution. The other problem, and I kind of hinted at it there, is the idea of transactions costs, or just the ability to find people to trade with or to offset your pollution can be problematic, even in a case where you have a defined area and you have a certain number of farmers who could be your non-point source trading partners, and setting up those transactions can be costly, and figuring out what counts as a reduction and what not. The management, so in theory they're quite nice. In implementation, they can be really messy, can require a lot of management and policy cost in terms of agencies managing those transactions. So overall, in some instances they've been successful, but I would say on a large scale they're limited in their applicability.
All right, good response. If there aren't any other questions, I think we'll thank Adam. Oh, nope, Charles is typing again, so maybe we'll give him a moment to just to thank you. Okay, we're going to thank Adam and close the recording, and